She had filed 17 formal complaints, 17, each one documented, each one time-stamped, each one backed by patient records, witness statements, and internal policy violations that would have ended careers at any other hospital in the country. And every single one had been buried, not misplaced, not delayed, buried, deliberately, systematically, by the very people who were supposed to protect the patients she was fighting for. Her name was Dr. Catherine Mercer, and for 3 years she had served as the lead patient advocate at Ridgemont Regional Medical Center, a 400-bed hospital that sat in the shadow of one of the most powerful military installations in the western United States. The building itself looked like any other regional hospital. Beige walls, sterile corridors, and the faint smell of disinfectant mixed with cafeteria food. But inside those unremarkable walls, Catherine had witnessed a level of institutional corruption that would have made headline news in any major city if anyone had been willing to listen. The first time Catherine realized what she was dealing with, it was not a dramatic moment. It was a spreadsheet, a billing report that did not quite add up, numbers that should have matched but did not. She had asked a simple question: can someone explain this discrepancy? The response was not an explanation. It was a warning, spoken politely, delivered with a smile, but unmistakable in its intent. Some things are better left alone. That was 3 years ago. Since then, Catherine had learned that Ridgemont's problems went far deeper than a few questionable billing entries. She had seen things inside those walls that kept her awake at night. Elderly patients left without pain medication for hours because their charts had been lost. Surgical teams operating on the wrong side of a patient's body and then altering records to cover the mistake. A billing department that charged dying veterans for procedures that were never performed. And when she reported it, when she followed every protocol, filled every form, copied every administrator, they did not thank her. They did not investigate. They punished her. First, they reduced her access to patient files. Then, they reassigned her to a windowless office in the basement. Then they started documenting her for things that had never been issues before. Arriving 2 minutes late, using the wrong cover sheet on an internal memo, and parking in a spot that was technically reserved for maintenance. They wanted her to quit. That was the plan. Build a paper trail that made her look incompetent, make her working conditions unbearable, and wait for her to walk away. But here is the part they did not know. Here is the part that would unravel everything. Dr. Catherine Mercer was not just a patient advocate. Before she ever set foot in that hospital, before she ever read a single medical chart, she had spent 11 years working inside the most classified corridors of the United States Department of Defense. She held an active top-secret security clearance with sensitive, compartmented information access, a clearance level that fewer than 1% of Americans have ever been granted. And the people who were trying to silence her had no idea what that meant. They were about to find out. To understand what happened at Ridgemont Regional, you first need to understand who Catherine Mercer really was. She did not grow up wanting to work in healthcare. She grew up wanting to serve her country. Catherine was raised in a military family. Her father was a career army officer who deployed 3 times, twice to the Gulf and once to a classified operation he never spoke about. Her mother was a military nurse who spent 20 years working in base hospitals across 4 continents. Catherine grew up on military installations. She learned to read situations before she learned to read books. Her childhood was a masterclass in understanding systems. Military bases operate on structure, hierarchy, and protocol. Every regulation exists for a reason. Every chain of command serves a purpose. And Catherine watched her parents navigate that world with precision. She learned early that in complex organizations, the difference between success and failure often came down to understanding how information moved through the system. And more importantly, where it got stuck. By the time she was 22, she had graduated from Georgetown University with a degree in international security studies, and within 6 months, she was recruited into a civilian intelligence role within the Department of Defense. For the next 11 years, Catherine worked in threat assessment, risk analysis, and institutional accountability. Her job, the parts of it that were not classified, involved reviewing internal systems for vulnerabilities. She identified where protocols failed, where oversight broke down, while where people in positions of power were exploiting gaps in the system. She was, in the most literal sense, trained to find corruption, and she was exceptionally good at it. One of her earliest assignments involved auditing a defense contractor's compliance with federal acquisition regulations. On paper, everything looked perfect. The reports were immaculate, the numbers aligned. But Catherine noticed something in the metadata of the submitted documents, timestamps that did not match the claimed review dates. She dug deeper. She cross-referenced email logs, meeting calendars, and personnel records. Within 3 weeks, she had uncovered a pattern of backdated certifications that had allowed substandard equipment to be approved for deployment. Her findings prevented faulty communications hardware from being shipped to active combat zones. The investigation led to criminal charges against 4 executives and a complete restructuring of the contractor's quality assurance program. That investigation taught Catherine critical lessons she would later apply at Ridgemont. She learned that institutions protect themselves through complexity, layers of bureaucracy designed to obscure accountability. She learned that the most damaging evidence is often hiding in plain sight, buried in routine documents that everyone assumes someone else is reviewing. She learned that corruption rarely announces itself with obvious red flags. Instead, it manifests as small inconsistencies that, when examined systematically, reveal larger patterns. She also learned something about herself during those Pentagon years. She learned that she had a tolerance for institutional pressure that most people lacked. When senior officials pushed back on her findings, when defense contractors hired expensive lawyers to challenge her methodology, when colleagues suggested she was being too thorough, none of it moved her. The evidence was the evidence. The facts were the facts. And Catherine had been trained to trust those more than she trusted anyone's opinion about them. That was who Catherine Mercer was. She did not accept surface-level explanations. She did not take organizational assurances at face value. She followed the evidence wherever it led, regardless of who it implicated. During her time at the Pentagon, she held a top-secret/SCI security clearance. And for those unfamiliar with what that means, it is the highest standard clearance level granted by the United States government. It requires an exhaustive background investigation that examines every aspect of a person's life: financial records, personal relationships, travel history, psychological evaluations, and interviews with dozens of people from every stage of the applicant's life. People who hold this clearance have been vetted more thoroughly than most elected officials. They are trusted with information that, if disclosed, could endanger national security. Catherine passed that process. She lived inside that world. And when she left the Department of Defense at 33, it was not because she had failed. It was because she had watched her mother die. At her mother, the military nurse who had spent 2 decades caring for soldiers and their families, was diagnosed with an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer. And during the final months of her life, Catherine witnessed something that changed her forever. Her mother's care was mismanaged, not at some understaffed rural clinic. At a major medical facility, medications were administered late, pain management was inconsistent, critical lab results were delayed because of clerical errors. And when Catherine raised concerns, politely, professionally, through proper channels, she was told that these things happen and that the staff is doing their best. Her mother died in a hospital bed in pain, waiting for a dose of medication that arrived 45 minutes too late. Catherine sat with her mother through those final hours, and she held her hand. She watched the monitors. She saw the exact moment when the pain became unbearable, and the exact moment, 45 minutes later, when the nurse finally arrived with the medication that should have been administered on schedule. By then, her mother's breathing had become shallow. Her grip had weakened. The medication came too late to provide the comfort it was meant to deliver. In that moment, Catherine made a decision. She would not spend the rest of her career analyzing threats in classified briefing rooms. She would fight a different kind of institutional failure, the kind that happened in hospitals where vulnerable people trusted systems that were supposed to protect them. That was the moment Catherine Mercer decided that her next mission would not involve foreign threats or classified briefings. Her next mission would be fought inside hospitals. She would become the person who stood between patients and the systems that failed them. She went back to school. She earned a master's degree in healthcare administration with a focus on patient safety. She completed additional certifications in medical ethics and healthcare compliance, and when she applied for the position of lead patient advocate at Ridgemont Regional Medical Center, her resume was unlike anything the hiring committee had ever seen. They hired her immediately. What they did not realize was that they had just brought a trained intelligence professional into an institution that had been cutting corners, covering mistakes, and silencing critics for years. Catherine did not walk into Ridgemont looking for a fight. She walked in looking to do her job. But within her first 90 days, she understood that this hospital had problems that went far beyond the occasional paperwork error. The problems were structural, they were intentional, and they were being protected by the very people who were supposed to prevent them. The first complaint Catherine filed was about a patient named Harold Briggs. Harold was a 78-year-old Korean War veteran who had been admitted to Ridgemont for a routine knee replacement. The surgery was straightforward, the recovery should have been standard. But 3 days after the operation, Harold developed a post-surgical infection, one that the nursing staff had noted but that never made it into his treatment plan. Catherine found the notation buried in a shift report that had been filed but never reviewed by the attending physician. Harold spent 2 extra weeks in the hospital. He nearly lost the leg they had just repaired. When Catherine interviewed Harold's family, his daughter told her something that made Catherine's training kick in. The nurse who had documented the infection had tried to escalate it. She had called the attending physician's office twice. Both times she was told the doctor would review the chart when he had time. That review never happened. The infection progressed. And when Harold was finally treated, it required intravenous antibiotics and additional surgical debridement that could have been avoided with earlier intervention. Catherine documented everything. She filed a formal incident report through the hospital's internal compliance system. She attached the shift report, the treatment timeline, and a written analysis showing exactly where the chain of communication broke down. The report disappeared, not rejected, not responded to. It simply vanished from the system. When Catherine followed up, the compliance office told her there was no record of a submission matching that description. She had kept copies. She refiled it. She sent it directly to the chief medical officer. 2 days later, her supervisor called her in for a meeting. Not about Harold Briggs, about Catherine's tone in interdepartmental communications. She was told she needed to be more collaborative and less adversarial. That was the first warning sign, but it was not the last. The second complaint involved a billing irregularity that Catherine had found almost by accident. But she was reviewing discharge paperwork for a group of patients who had been transferred to a long-term care facility when she noticed that several of them had been billed for physical therapy sessions that took place after they had already left the building. She cross-referenced the billing codes with the facility's scheduling system. The sessions did not exist. The therapists listed on the invoices had not been on shift those days. The charges totaled more than $80,000 across a 6-month period. Catherine did what she had been trained to do at the Pentagon. She built a timeline. She mapped the pattern. She identified which departments were involved, which administrators had approval authority over the billing codes, and which external audits had somehow missed the discrepancy. And she prepared a chart showing the frequency of the phantom charges, their distribution across different insurance payers, and the specific billing codes that had been manipulated. It was the kind of evidence package that would hold up in a federal fraud investigation, because she had built hundreds of them during her time in defense intelligence. Catherine prepared a detailed report. She included the billing records, the scheduling data, and the discrepancies. She flagged it as a potential compliance violation under federal healthcare fraud statutes. She submitted it to the hospital's internal audit department and copied the director of finance. Within 48 hours, 3 things happened. First, Catherine's access to the hospital's billing system was revoked. She was told it was a routine security update and that her credentials would be restored shortly. They never were. Second, the director of finance requested a meeting, not to discuss the billing irregularity, but to inform Catherine that her role as patient advocate did not include financial oversight and that she had overstepped the boundaries of her position. Third, and this was the one that told Catherine everything she needed to know, the original billing records she had flagged were altered. The phantom therapy sessions were removed from the system retroactively. When Catherine checked the records again using her backup copies, the entries she had documented no longer matched what was in the hospital's database. Someone had changed them, and they had done it within 2 days of her report. Catherine did not panic. Panic was not in her training. Instead, she did what 11 years at the Department of Defense had taught her to do when she discovered that the people above her were compromised. She started building a case. She began documenting everything on a personal encrypted device, the same kind she had used during her intelligence career. She created a timeline. She saved screenshots. She recorded the dates and times of every meeting, every email, every conversation where she had raised a concern and been shut down. She began using techniques she had learned in counterintelligence training. She created redundant backups stored in multiple secure locations. She documented her work environment with time-stamped photographs. She saved email headers to prove when messages were sent and received. She kept a daily journal, written in her own hand, or not on any hospital system, that recorded every interaction, every retaliatory action, every attempt to undermine her credibility. She knew that eventually the hospital would make a move that crossed a legal line. They always did. Institutional corruption follows predictable patterns, and when that moment came, Catherine would be ready. Between the billing fraud discovery and Maria Santos's case, there were others. Each one followed the same pattern. Each one reinforced what Catherine already knew. There was the case of James Mitchell, a 56-year-old construction worker who came in for routine blood work and was told his cholesterol was slightly elevated. The lab results showed dangerously high levels that should have triggered immediate intervention and lifestyle counseling. But those results sat in a digital queue for 3 weeks before anyone followed up. By the time Catherine discovered the delay, while reviewing unrelated patient files, James had suffered a mild heart attack. When she traced the communication breakdown, she found that the electronic notification system had been misconfigured, sending alerts to an inbox that no one monitored. The problem had existed for 7 months. Catherine's report on the issue was acknowledged with a promise to look into it. The misconfiguration was never fixed. There was the case of Sarah Chen, a 32-year-old accountant who came to the emergency department after a car accident. The initial X-rays showed a possible fracture in her wrist. Protocol required a specialist consultation within 24 hours. The consultation never happened. Sarah was sent home with a splint and instructions to follow up with her primary care physician. When she returned 2 weeks later with severe pain and limited mobility, a CT scan revealed that the fracture had been more serious than initially assessed and had begun to heal incorrectly. She required surgery that could have been avoided with proper initial treatment. Catherine documented the missed consultation, the gap in follow-up procedures, and the lack of accountability in the referral system. Her report was filed under administrative review, a category she had learned meant permanently ignored. Each case taught Catherine something about how the hospital protected itself. They did not deny problems outright. They acknowledged them with carefully worded statements that accepted no actual responsibility, and they promised reviews that never materialized. They created committees that never met. They generated paperwork that gave the appearance of action while ensuring that nothing fundamentally changed. It was a sophisticated operation, and it had been working for years. The third complaint, the one that would eventually trigger the most devastating consequences for the hospital, involved a patient named Maria Santos. Maria was a 44-year-old mother of 3 who had come to Ridgemont's emergency department with severe abdominal pain. She waited over 6 hours in the emergency room. When she was finally seen, the attending physician ordered basic blood work and sent her home with a prescription for over-the-counter pain relief. 72 hours later, Maria was back. This time, she arrived by ambulance. Her appendix had ruptured. She went into septic shock on the operating table. She survived, but the infection caused damage that required 2 additional surgeries and left her unable to work for 8 months. Catherine reviewed Maria's initial ER visit. The triage nurse had flagged her symptoms as potentially serious. The recommended protocol was an abdominal CT scan. It was never ordered. The attending physician's notes indicated that he had assessed the patient as low acuity, a designation that did not match the triage nurse's documentation. When Catherine interviewed Maria weeks later, still recovering from her 3rd surgery, Maria told her something that crystallized the entire problem. The attending physician who had sent her home had spent less than 4 minutes with her. Maria remembered because she had been watching the clock on the wall, and wondering when someone would take her pain seriously. 4 minutes. No physical examination beyond checking her pulse. No follow-up questions about the location or severity of the pain. Just a glance at her chart, a dismissive comment about gastric distress, and a prescription she could have bought at any pharmacy without seeing a doctor at all. Catherine filed the complaint. She included the triage records, the physician's notes, the discrepancy analysis, and a recommendation for an immediate peer review of the attending physician's ER cases over the previous 12 months. This time, the hospital did not just ignore her. This time, they came after her directly. Catherine was placed on administrative leave pending a performance review. Her office was cleared. Her hospital-issued devices were confiscated. And when she arrived the following Monday to meet with Human Resources, she was told that the hospital was exploring whether her position was still necessary given current budget constraints. They were going to fire her. They were going to fire the only person in that building who had been doing her job. And they expected her to go quietly. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. Catherine arrived at 8:45. She was dressed in a dark suit. She carried a single leather briefcase. She did not bring a lawyer. She did not bring a union representative. She came alone. Across the table sat 5 people: the hospital's chief executive officer, the chief medical officer, the director of human resources, the director of compliance, and an outside attorney the hospital had retained from one of the most expensive law firms in the state. They expected this to be a termination meeting. The paperwork was already prepared. The separation agreement was in a folder at the center of the table. They had even calculated her final paycheck down to the hour. The CEO sat at the head of the table, flanked by his executive team. The outside attorney had positioned himself strategically, close enough to advise, far enough to maintain the appearance of objectivity. They had rehearsed this. Catherine could tell from the way they had arranged their materials, from the coordinated body language, from the slight nods they exchanged as she sat down. This was meant to be quick, professional, irreversible. Catherine sat down. She placed her briefcase on the table. She did not open it immediately. The CEO began speaking. He talked about organizational restructuring. He talked about evolving priorities. He talked about how Catherine's contributions were valued, but that the hospital needed to move in a different direction. Catherine let him finish. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. When he was done, she asked one question. "Are you finished?" The room went quiet. Then she opened her briefcase. She removed a single binder, 2 inches thick, organized with color-coded tabs, and printed on paper that bore a watermark the outside attorney recognized immediately. It was the kind of organizational formatting used in federal intelligence documentation. Catherine placed the binder on the table and spoke calmly. "Before we continue, there are a few things you should know about me that apparently did not come up during your preparation for this meeting." She told them about her 11 years at the Department of Defense. She told them about her top-secret/SCI security clearance, a clearance that remained active. She told them about her training in institutional threat assessment, fraud detection, and systems accountability. She told them that she had spent the last 14 months building a comprehensive case file that documented every complaint she had filed, every act of retaliation she had experienced, and every instance where hospital administrators had altered, destroyed, or suppressed evidence of patient safety violations and financial fraud. She opened the binder to the first tab. Harold Briggs, the label read. She slid it across the table. And inside was not just her original complaint, it was the deleted compliance report, the one the hospital claimed never existed, along with metadata showing when it had been purged from the system and by which administrators' credentials. It was the shift report with the infection notation. It was a signed statement from the nurse who had tried to escalate the issue. It was the hospital's own protocol manual with the relevant sections highlighted, showing exactly which procedures had been violated. She flipped to the second tab, Financial Irregularities. This section contained not just the billing discrepancies she had originally reported, but a complete forensic analysis of the hospital's therapy billing over 18 months. She had tracked every phantom charge, cross-referenced them with staff schedules. It identified patterns in which insurance providers were targeted and mapped the approval chain. She had screenshots of the original database entries, time-stamped and authenticated, alongside screenshots of the altered records, proving that someone with administrative access had retroactively modified the billing data. The third tab was labeled Maria Santos. The fourth was James Mitchell. The fifth was Sarah Chen. Each one contained the same level of documentation. Each one proved not just that a mistake had been made, but that the hospital had actively worked to conceal it. The director of compliance, the woman who had told Catherine her billing investigation was outside her scope, but was visibly pale. The chief medical officer had stopped making eye contact. The CEO's carefully practiced composure had cracked, but the outside attorney reached for the binder. Catherine did not stop him. She had 16 more copies in secure storage. "You should also know," Catherine continued, her voice still calm, still measured, "that I am not operating alone. The federal investigators who received these files have already begun preliminary document requests. The State Attorney General's office has opened a formal inquiry, and the Department of Defense Inspector General is particularly interested in your TRICARE billing practices, given that this hospital holds contracts for military family care." She paused. The silence in the room was absolute. "Now you had prepared termination paperwork. I assume you would like to reconsider that approach." She told them that this case file did not exist, only in the binder on the table. The copies had been transmitted, say, through secure, verified channels, to the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, to the State's Attorney General Office of Healthcare Fraud, to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and to the Office of the Inspector General at the Department of Defense, because Ridgemont Regional received federal funding through military healthcare contracts. She told them that under the False Claims Act and the applicable state whistleblower protection statutes, any attempt to terminate, demote, or further retaliate against her would constitute a federal offense carrying both civil and criminal penalties. And then she said the sentence that, according to 3 people who were in that room, caused the outside attorney to close his folder and set down his pen. "I've spent my career identifying threats to systems that protect people. You are a threat to the system that protects your patients. And I want you to understand with absolute clarity that I am not the kind of person who makes complaints and hopes someone listens. I am the kind of person who builds a case so complete that by the time you realize what has happened, your only remaining option is to cooperate." The CEO looked at his attorney. The attorney looked at the binder. Then he asked if the meeting could be paused. It was paused for 45 minutes. When they returned, the termination paperwork was gone from the table. The separation agreement had been removed. The tone had changed completely. Catherine was no longer a problem to be managed. She was a threat they had catastrophically underestimated. Indeed, and the evidence she had assembled was already in the hands of people who had the authority to dismantle their entire operation. The chess game was over. Catherine had not just won the position, she had won the entire board. What followed was not swift. Justice in the American healthcare system rarely is, but it was thorough. Within 60 days of that meeting, the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General opened a formal investigation into Ridgemont Regional Medical Center. Investigators arrived with subpoenas for financial records, patient files, internal communications, and human resources documentation going back 5 years. What they found confirmed everything Catherine had documented, and more. The billing fraud was not limited to the physical therapy charges Catherine had flagged, and the investigation uncovered a pattern of fraudulent billing across multiple departments, totaling more than $4 million in false claims submitted to Medicare, Medicaid, and TRICARE, the military health care program. Procedures that were never performed, equipment that was never delivered, consultations that never happened. All of it billed to federal programs. All of it paid with taxpayer money. The patient safety violations were equally damning. Investigators identified 37 incidents over a 4-year period where adverse patient outcomes had been inadequately reported, improperly documented, or actively concealed. In 11 of those cases, the evidence suggested that hospital administrators had directly intervened to alter or suppress incident reports. Harold Briggs, the Korean War veteran whose post-surgical infection had been Catherine's first complaint, was one of those cases. Maria Santos, the mother whose ruptured appendix could have been prevented, was another. The human cost was not abstract. These were real people, real families, real suffering that could have been reduced or prevented if the institution had done what it was supposed to do. The federal investigation uncovered other victims, a 62-year-old woman who had been discharged too early after cardiac surgery and had to be readmitted in heart failure. A 17-year-old athlete whose torn ACL was initially diagnosed as a sprain, delaying surgery for 6 months and ending his college scholarship prospects. An elderly man with diabetes whose medication dosages had been incorrectly transcribed, on leading to a hypoglycemic episode that caused a fall and hip fracture. Each case had been documented internally. Each case had been buried. The investigation process itself was exhaustive. Federal agents conducted more than 200 interviews. They reviewed thousands of pages of documents. They brought in forensic accountants who traced the flow of fraudulent billing claims through the hospital's financial systems. They brought in medical experts who analyzed clinical decisions and identified patterns of substandard care. The hospital's internal culture was laid bare. Investigators found emails where administrators discussed how to manage patient advocates who asked too many questions. And they found meeting minutes where compliance concerns were dismissed as overreactions. They found performance reviews where staff members who raised safety issues were marked down for being not team players. The evidence painted a picture of an institution where the appearance of quality care mattered more than actual quality care, where quarterly financial targets took priority over patient outcomes, where the people responsible for oversight were the same people benefiting from the lack of it. The consequences came in stages. The CEO of Ridgemont Regional resigned within 90 days of the investigation's commencement. He was not charged criminally, but he agreed to a permanent exclusion from participation in any federally funded healthcare program. His career in healthcare was over. The chief medical officer was placed on administrative leave and subsequently terminated. The state medical board opened a separate investigation into his oversight of the clinical incidents Catherine had flagged. He surrendered his medical license rather than face a public hearing. The director of compliance, the person who had told Catherine that her billing report was outside her scope, was charged with obstruction and making false statements to federal investigators. She pleaded guilty to a reduced charge and received 18 months of supervised probation. The director of finance was indicted on 4 counts of healthcare fraud. His case went to trial. He was convicted on 3 counts and sentenced to 37 months in federal prison. The outside attorney, who had been hired to manage Catherine's termination, quietly withdrew from the engagement. His firm was later named in a separate civil action filed by a group of patients who alleged that the firm had been aware of the hospital's practices and had provided legal cover for the suppression of complaint records. Ridgemont Regional itself was placed under a federal corporate integrity agreement, a 5-year oversight arrangement that required the hospital to submit to external audits, implement new compliance training, establish an independent patient safety board, and report directly to federal monitors on a quarterly basis. The hospital was not shut down. Hospitals rarely are. The community needed it. But the institution that emerged from the investigation was fundamentally different from the one Catherine had walked into 3 years earlier. New leadership was installed. The compliance department was rebuilt from the ground up. Patient advocacy was elevated from a basement office to a department with direct reporting access to the board of directors. And Catherine Mercer was reinstated to her position, with full back pay, a formal written apology from the board, and a new title: Senior Director of Patient Safety and Institutional Accountability. But Catherine did not celebrate, because she knew what the headlines would never say. She knew about the months of isolation, the stress that affected her health. The nights she sat alone in her apartment wondering if she had made the right choice, if the fight was worth the cost. She knew about the colleagues who had stopped talking to her, the staff members who crossed to the other side of the hallway when they saw her coming, the anonymous emails telling her she was destroying the hospital, that she was costing people their jobs, that she should have kept her mouth shut. There were days during the investigation when Catherine questioned everything, days when she wondered if the cost was too high, days when she sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, unable to make herself walk through those doors one more time. She had developed insomnia. She had stopped seeing friends. She had missed holidays with her family because the investigation demanded her constant attention. Federal attorneys needed clarification on documents. Investigators needed her to walk them through timelines. Every week brought new depositions, new interviews, new requests for information that required her to relive the very experiences that had driven her to this point. Her reputation within the healthcare community had become complicated. Some saw her as a hero, others saw her as a troublemaker who had damaged a vital community institution. Job offers from other hospitals dried up. Who wanted to hire the woman who had brought down an entire executive team? She knew about Harold Briggs, who had recovered from his infection, but who told Catherine that he no longer trusted hospitals. She knew about Maria Santos, who had survived her ordeal, but whose medical bills had pushed her family into debt that would take years to resolve. Justice had been served. But justice and healing are not the same thing. And Catherine understood that better than anyone. There is a particular kind of courage that does not look like courage at all. It does not involve raised voices or dramatic confrontations. It does not come with a soundtrack or a standing ovation. It looks like a woman sitting at a desk at 2 in the morning, cross-referencing billing codes against scheduling records. It looks like someone filing a 17th complaint after the first 16 were ignored. It looks like a person who has every reason to walk away, choosing instead to stay and fight. Not because the fight is easy, but because the people she is fighting for cannot fight for themselves. Catherine Mercer did not set out to expose a corrupt hospital. She set out to do the job she was hired to do. And when the institution tried to destroy her for doing it, she fell back on the training and the discipline that had been forged in the most demanding environment on earth. The people who tried to silence her made a fundamental miscalculation. They looked at her title, patient advocate, and assumed she was someone who could be managed, someone who would file a complaint, get ignored, and eventually move on. They did not bother to look deeper. They did not ask where she came from. They did not consider the possibility that the quiet woman in the basement office had spent a decade inside the Pentagon building cases against threats far more sophisticated than a hospital billing department. And that failure, the failure to take her seriously, was their undoing. But this story is not really about security clearances or federal investigations. Those are the mechanisms. They are not the meaning. The meaning is this. Every system that is supposed to protect people depends on the willingness of someone inside that system to speak up when it fails. And in almost every case, the person who speaks up pays a price for it. They are isolated, they are punished, they are told they are the problem. Most of them do not have Pentagon training. Most of them do not have classified clearances or encrypted backup devices or contacts at the Inspector General's office. Most of them are ordinary people who see something wrong and try to do something about it and get crushed for the effort. Catherine's story ended with accountability. But for every Catherine, there are hundreds of others whose stories ended with resignation letters and silence. People who were pushed out, worn down and forgotten. And that is the part of this story that should stay with you. Not the victory, not the courtroom drama, not the moment the CEO's face went pale. What should stay with you is the question, What happens when the next Catherine files her complaint and she does not have a Pentagon clearance to fall back on? What happens when the person telling the truth has no leverage at all, just the truth itself? That is the question this story leaves behind. And it is a question that every hospital, every institution, and every person in a position of power should be required to answer. Because the system does not fix itself. It never has. It is fixed by people like Catherine Mercer, people who refuse to be silent, even when silence is the only thing the system rewards. If this story moved you, if it made you think about someone you know or something you have seen, share it. Not for the algorithm, not for the channel. Share it because stories like this only matter if they reach the people who need to hear them. And if you are someone who is in a fight, like Catherine's right now, if you are the person filing complaints that no one reads, raising concerns that no one acknowledges, I want you to hear this. You are not alone. You are not wrong. And you are not powerless. The truth has a weight that institutions cannot carry forever. Eventually it breaks through. Subscribe if you believe that. I will see you in the next one. Before you go, there is another story you need to hear. A military surgeon was accused of making a fatal mistake during a classified operation overseas. The official report said it was negligence. His commanding officer said he should face a court-martial. His own medical team refused to speak in his defense. But when an independent review board pulled the original operation footage that the military had classified for 6 years, they found something that no one expected. The surgeon had not made a mistake. He had been set up. That story is right here. Click it now. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Every week, we bring you stories of people who fought back against the systems that tried to break them. And hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and I will see you in the next one.